Hello, I'm Maria Williams with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnership calls and webinars, news feeds, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's CHE Partnership webinar, which is titled, We Can't Delay Action on Environmental Public Health. Our moderator today is Karen Wong, Director of CHE. We will leave time following the presentation for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions through the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentation. After the presentation, our moderator will read questions out for our panelists to respond to. We will get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speakers. This webinar is scheduled to last for 60 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Karen.
Hello, great, thank you. I'm Karen Wang, the Director of CHE. Welcome to today's webinar. When I first read the essay, We Can't Delay Action on Environmental Public Health, I was deeply inspired. In any professional arena, perhaps the most important factor for future progress is the commitment of students in the field. And CHE is especially pleased to feature some of these future leaders today. Anna Young is pursuing a Master of Science degree in Environmental Health at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Augusta Williams is a third-year doctoral student at the Environmental Health Department, also at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Her work there looks at the intersection between climate change, the built environment, and public health. Yasamina McBride works with the team of Harvard's at the Harvard Center for Health and Global Environment to produce executive education programming and is also a graduate student at the University of Houston. We were excited to see their recent call to action in Scientific American and to introduce them and how this effort came about and give some background. We welcome Professor Joseph Allen, who's the Assistant Professor at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and Director of the Healthy Buildings Program at the Harvard Center for Health and the Global Environment. We will hear from him and then each of the students, followed by an opportunity for question and dialogue. A reminder that during the talk, you can post questions through the Zoom Q&A box, but they will only be answered during the Q&A period. So to begin, here is Dr. Allen.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much, Karen, for that introduction. I just want to say I share your feeling that after reading this essay by these students, I had the same feeling of feeling deeply inspired. So it's a pleasure for me to be here and kind of give some background on the project. So I want to thank the Collaborative on Health and the Environment for hosting the webinar and for all of you who joined us today. Really, my job is easy. I'm going to give a short introduction of the Environmentalist Papers, and then we'll pass it off to these three terrific students. So some of the motivation for this, what we call the Environmentalist Papers, I think it's unequivocal that there's an assault on environmental protections underway. And like many others after the election in November, I thought long and hard about how to be effective, right? I care deeply about so many of these topics: immigration, homeland security, health policy. But in thinking about how to be most effective, really wanted to stay in the domain where I have public credibility, and that is in this topic of environmental health. And so in thinking about how to engage in this conversation of environmental health, it really narrowed, that thinking helped to narrow my search to say, well, this is an area where we can affect the public conversation, really around the environmental health. And then next, I started to think about, well, and think about how to be effective. I wanted to think about the goals, strategies, and then tactics for how to do this. I think very often we see, or I see, that when people are activated and want to affect some change, very often we jump right to tactics without thinking of the larger goal. So for the environmentalist papers, the goal I set was, we really want to maintain and advance what I see, and I think most would agree, are widely supported existing environmental protections. And the strategy was to focus on the link between environment and health. Really reinforce that this is, when we talk about environment, we're talking about health. And last is what's the tactic? And this is the environmentalist papers. We wanted to leverage the voice of public health scientists around the country to really elevate this conversation in a nonpartisan way. So these are the facts related to how the environment impacts our health. And we want to be sure these environmental protections stay in place. So why the environmentalist? Well, I'm a fan of the musical Hamilton, probably like many people on the phone are, and I really like the messages in the musical, even this notion that history has its eyes on you. And at one point, Hamilton speaking to Burr, if you stand for nothing, Burr, what do you fall for? And Hamilton was a prolific writer. And in the musical, they talk about why do you write like you're running out of time? He was so passionate. And then when he started writing about the Constitution and the form of government that was taking shape, he created the Federalist Papers that he wrote with Madison and Jay. And I started to read the Federalist Papers, and in particular, Federalist #1, and I saw an immediate connection to our work. And there's one quote on the screen talking about the crisis at which we arrived at and the severity of the time. And Hamilton continues from this quote. He says, the plan offered to our deliberations affects too many particular interests, innovates upon too many local institutions, not to involve in its discussion a variety of objects foreign to its merits, and of views, passions, and prejudices little favorable to the discovery of truth. And even warns about so-called alternative facts. He says, in the course of the preceding observations, I have had an eye, my fellow citizens, to putting you upon your guard against all attempts, from whatever quarter, to influence your decision in a matter of the utmost moment to your welfare by any impressions other than those which may result from the evidence of truth. And we wanted to, so the writing it immediately struck a chord with me. And actually, when we first wrote Environmentalist #1, we followed how Hamilton wrote Federalist #1, even starting with a call to, or address to the people of the United States of America, which is how Federalist #1 starts. So together with Ari Bernstein and Tracy Woodruff, we outlined the goals of this project. And in Environmentalists, we proposed in this series of papers and essays to demonstrate that the environment is inseparable from our health. We intend to make a vigorous defense of the environment. And we will make the case that while much has been accomplished, it can be dismantled and even reversed. And there's more to be gained by continuing to advance the science and protection. This Environmentalist Papers was covered in an article by Fast Company, and I like the quote at the end. They say, the Environmentalist Papers may not exactly have the dash and eloquence of Hamilton's writing. That's fair. Who could ever be Hamilton? That's not our goal. And they go on, but they make an important point well enough. When we cut back on the environmental protection, we do more than harm lakes, rivers, and atmospheres. We'll potentially harm ourselves. So I like that end, except it's not that we potentially harm ourselves when we cut back these environmental protections. It's guaranteed that we're going to harm ourselves. And the science really is unambiguous. And as you see this quote up here, I like from Einstein, we have an obligation to not be silent. It is actually part of the public health mission. So I encourage you to read and share all of the Environmentalist Papers. They're available at the site that's on the screen, environmentalistpapers.org, now numbering 8 with many more on the way from excellent scientists across the United States. And the most important environmentalist paper to me is the one written by the students here. It is the voice of the future of environmental health, and it's very powerful. So I'm really proud to be here with them today, and I'll turn it over to Augusta.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the motivation behind what led us to write this. And as soon as I heard that Dr. Allen and others here at the school were leading this Environmentalist Papers effort, and it really started gaining momentum, it was happening at the same time that the students that we learn amongst had this growing urgency and an energy to say something about the world that we were living in at that time and the threats to environmental health that were unfolding around us. So when Dr. Allen released the papers and said that a student perspective would be one that he'd be interested in, the three of us, Anna, Yasamina, and I, collectively came together with a few similar motivations that we wanted to share as the student perspective. Throughout the history of the environmental movement, and even in recent discussions of environmental advocacy, leaders often phrase environmental issues as those that are important for future grandchildren. This is the framing that we have become extremely familiar with, and we were all motivated by the realization that we are those grandchildren. The impacts of environmental degradation and climate change are being experienced right now by people today and are affecting our own lives in many ways. We've made a lot of progress in providing clean air, clean water, and clean land that ensure both public health and environmental protection. But as those are being threatened, it will be left for us to live in these polluted spaces, to drink dirty water, and protect our own health and the public's health in the near future. And the burden and the cost associated with these environmental rollbacks will also be on us to solve as the next generation of scientists. So we are really seeing our futures being altered in real time as there was a change in administration. And in this field, we all have had a longstanding passion for the environment and its protection, but as students, our futures were becoming more and more uncertain, and the jobs and careers that will be available to us one day are becoming more questionable. As science is continually pushed to the back burner of the federal government's budget, research funding is being cut for science and health fields across the country, and this will directly influence where we as students can someday work, the questions that we can ask, and the problems that we're going to be able to solve. The jobs and careers that we grew up striving towards and the agencies that we dreamed of working at are being changed and some even dismantled. So in addition to having our voices heard as environmental advocates and scientists, we've also been feeling threatened professionally as we are the next generation of environmental leaders. So we as students have been wanting to do something, have been wanting to say something during these times because we know that we have the knowledge on the issues. We are possessing and growing our toolbox to make change, and there's been a disconnect between those things that we have and what's happening around us, and our voice sometimes missing at the table. So to prepare for the daunting tasks ahead of us, we wanted to vocalize to the current leaders, our mentors, and the public that we are here, we are working. And although sometimes we're a little scared and skeptical, we are extremely hopeful and we're not going anywhere. So as Anna, Yasamina, and myself came together to discuss our interest in writing the student perspective for the Environmentalist Papers, we shared these collective motivations and the realization that none of us were feeling these things in isolation. Through this piece, I hoped we could connect with other students in our field who are feeling similarly and further express to all of these leaders, both within our government and with our own field of environmental health today.
Thank you, Augusta. So because of our frustration at how politically polarizing environmental health issues have become and how incendiary the discussions can be, we sought techniques to better communicate these pressing issues in a way that people would understand, relate to, and want to act on. We wanted to engage a diverse audience on these issues and not just speak in the language of other scientists and experts who already understand the importance of action. Engagement of the public on environmental issues is particularly challenging today because of how complex and subtle the problems can be. In the 1960s, the country saw the Cuyahoga River in Ohio catch on fire because it was so polluted, saw heavy smog envelop New York and Los Angeles, and saw trucks spraying the highly toxic insecticide DDT all over the country until Rachel Carson brought the issue to national attention. These highly visible and urgent environmental problems helped the U.S. pass crucial regulations to protect our environment and our health. Today, however, we still face a myriad of environmental health issues, but these issues and their health consequences are subtle, cumulative, and less discernible. These seemingly nebulous issues are difficult for an average individual to justify the cost of action on. For climate change in particular, the major pitfall of communication is how it will personally harm individuals. National maps by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication this year showed that 71% of Americans trust scientists about global warming, but only 40% think it will harm them personally. Our fundamental communication challenge right now is conveying to people that climate change and other environmental issues will negatively affect their own daily lives. we need to show that the problems are present, personal, pressing, and very real. Before writing our article, we identified a few objectives for our communication strategies. First, we wanted to personalize the science as much as possible. We know that people struggle to digest complex scientific data, graphs, and details. Because this type of information is so difficult to understand and emotionally distant, people tend to stay unengaged and stick with their current stance. People also digest information in a way that reaffirms the views that they already hold. So we need to appeal to the values that they have. For these reasons, we strove to make environmental health issues real for the readers by writing narratives and communicating environmental health as public health, a value widely held by individuals. Researchers, psychologists, and communication experts have shown that this public health framing is very effective. So in these ways, we tried to convey that the issues will be personal for everyone and that government action would benefit all of us, not threaten our livelihoods and values. Although there are countless stories about the impacts of environmental issues, we selected 5 vignettes to write about to share the real impacts of environmental health issues on American lives and the direct consequences of inaction. We chose issues that are happening now to millions of individuals and that affect fundamental things people care about: their homes, their food, their drinking water, their products, and their livelihoods. Augusta, Yasamina, and I will describe 3 of the stories later on. And we hope that each reader would be able to see themselves or somebody they care about in these stories. As part of this, our second communication objective was to use simple, clear messages. We wrote for the general public and strove to use accessible language and relatable content, avoiding scientific jargon and unnecessary details. We wanted the readers to develop an understanding and relate to these stories so that we could have a continued, engaged conversation about the issues. We did not want to discuss these issues as partisan or polarize people by threatening their political values. These environmental issues are health issues, fundamental human issues, and should not be partisan. We chose to write 5 stories about personal impacts so that hopefully the reader would engage with and relate to narratives that appealed directly to their values. Lastly, we needed to convey the consensus on these issues and the importance of action across the country. Coming together as student voices seemed very fitting for discussion on the future of environmental health. We collected signatures on our article from over 100 students from 23 universities and 27 different home states. We wanted to come together as a generation of current students whose futures are tightly intertwined with government action or inaction on environmental protections. We wanted to show that these are issues we all know to be true and care about. We wanted to show that this call for action is not from just one individual, one institution, or one political party. So we'll now discuss 3 of the issues that we wrote about in our article that exemplify some of the challenges we face. So first, we all use consumer products, from soaps and cleaning products to toys and cosmetics. There are over 80,000 chemicals in commerce, but only about 1% have been studied for safety, and even fewer have been successfully regulated. Yet, we trust our products and assume them to be safe. The result is a slew of toxic chemicals from thousands of products that we are exposed to without knowing or consenting. Pregnant women and children are particularly vulnerable to these exposures and their health effects. And there has been a lot of consumer push for safer products, and industry has eliminated certain chemicals that are widely publicized to be toxic. However, even these products labeled to be safe, non-toxic, or natural still contain toxic or unstudied chemicals. Historically, we have removed harmful chemicals only one at a time, and the result is a phenomenon called regrettable substitution, or chemical whack-a-mole, where one toxic chemical is simply replaced with another. The classic example is BPA-free reusable water bottles. BPA is commonly known to be toxic, in particular to reproductive health, but a smaller portion of the public knows that it was largely replaced by BPS, a similar and potentially even more harmful chemical. Even fewer people realize that most of our seats are coated with BPA, which can absorb into our skin. I've also been researching regrettable substitution in nail polishes. One nail salon owner I've collaborated with proudly told me We only buy safe, non-toxic nail polishes for our salon. She would not and could not know that while the so-called safer nail polishes didn't contain one toxic phthalate, they now just use another plasticizer, triphenyl phosphate, which similarly has hormonal disruption problems. As consumers, we can continue to push for safer products, but it would be impossible for us to stay fully informed on the never-ending evolution of toxic ingredients, and we shouldn't have to. Last year's update to the Toxic Substances Control Act, a remarkably bipartisan effort with industry support, made crucial updates to the EPA's power to understand, approve, and regulate chemicals in commerce. But still, the progress to regulate the known toxic chemicals will be slow, and we are still regulating only one chemical at a time. Cosmetics, on the other hand, fall under the jurisdiction of the Food and Drug Administration. And these products, such as nail polish, don't need approval before they go to market. Federal regulation of the chemicals in cosmetics hasn't been updated since the 1930s. As consumers, we must advocate for stronger policies on chemicals, and we must make our representatives listen to these pressing issues.
Thanks, Anna. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the agricultural vignette that was featured in our piece. I grew up in a very small agricultural town in northern New York State, and my dad is a multiple generation farmer. And I've grown up seeing firsthand the connection and the respect for the earth that farmers have each and every day. They work tirelessly, often against the odds, to provide food for our entire population. Sometimes, though, the messages around agriculture can have negative connotations. And I will be the first to admit that there is a lot of work to do in making agriculture more sustainable and efficient, but I think there's other more positive ways to do this. Many consumers know very little about where their food is actually coming from and how hard a farmer worked to get it to them. Family farmers depend on Mother Nature for their livelihood and in turn try as hard as they can at any given time to protect that because their livelihood depends on it. Farmers are always facing many hurdles, trying to improve crop yields while fighting against uncooperative weather patterns, increasing costs of fuel and seeding and fertilizer while needing to maintain a herd, crops, equipment, a workforce, striving to balance their farm's prosperity with the growth and the livelihood of their own family, all while exposing themselves to demanding work conditions and potentially harmful exposures. None of these are new challenges. With climate change, though, more extreme precipitation patterns, increasing frequency and severity of heat waves, changing habitats for pests and weeds, growing populations even, are making these problems even more challenging for the agricultural community to face. And this is all occurring at a time when consumers are rightfully demanding more transparency in the food they are eating and more sustainable agricultural practices. So I wanted to provide a glimpse into this perspective while policies in the US and some states are making it harder to balance all of these things today, such as allowing streams to be polluted that can harm herds and crops downstream, or continuing the use of harmful pesticides that farmers and their families are directly exposed to. We have to remember that everyone is a multidimensional human being, and asking farmers to make leaps towards certain practices while not allowing them the capacity to address the problems they face in this very moment is not going to be successful. So I wanted to give a glimpse of this perspective of the agricultural community in hopes that we can all think about ways we can all do better as the farmers trying to reduce emissions, stores and distributors when it comes to food waste, and consumers who need to realize the power that they hold in their hands when standing at the checkout line buying groceries, and the policymakers who must think about the future of balancing all these challenges. Because we all have to do better when it comes to agriculture and understanding the decisions that go into growing and harvesting all of the food we consume from the farm to our own kitchen tables.
Thank you, Augusta. Like Augusta and like Anna, I personally had a feeling about the lead water story that was we discussed inside of the article. Lead is something for which the CDC says there are no known safe levels. In the city of Flint, I lived outside of Flint, approximately a half an hour in a very small rural town. And although Flint was something where we might go to go grocery shopping, I was familiar with the area. So the story, again, it translated personally to me. For those of you who are not aware of the Flint water crisis and what happened there, I'll just give you a brief recap. In 2010, a company, a new corporation, KWA, was formed to provide water from Lake Huron. And in the Flint area in particular, and Detroit has very similar problems where they were under emergency management. So an emergency manager was brought in because of the severe financial crisis that existed in both cities. And what the managers are tasked with is to actually try to bring some order to the chaos that had become both of those cities financially. As one of those steps in 2013, the city had decided to switch its water supplier. During the time that it switched its water supplier, the location where the water was coming from and through the lead pipes, sorry about that. For the emergency manager, when the water was coming through the pipes, it wound up inside of the homes. And that was something that wasn't expected by the citizens of Flint. The citizens of Flint were sort of outside of the decision-making process, but it was something that impacted them personally when it came to their homes. Tests that had been done in Flint water system showed that out of 26 homes, some of those homes showed 150 parts of lead, where 15 parts per billion is something that's more in the normal line. And what that does is it exposes the children to lead, and it exposes them to repercussions that are difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. So those are things such as slow growth and development, learning and behavior problems, hearing and speech problems. And at the current estimate, there are approximately 8,000 children who have been exposed to lead at a level which they are now going to have to deal with these problems. So for me, the story about the lead was something that was personal. It was something that could be related to and should be communicated with to. So when we look at going to the future, we're at a choice point, and this is something that Anna and Augusta and I had discussed. We're at an area now where we get to decide what that future is going to be. When we look at future framing, because you heard my background and part of that is in futures, we have a choice. We can decide to do more of the same. We can decide that we will have a slow but steady decline, or we could decide that we'll have a transformation. And a transformation, of course, is one of the most difficult of those, and it's something that requires a vision. So despite all of the things that we see in our environment, and in spite of all of the things that have happened health-wise, we know that there are things that are wrong, but we felt that there was still cause for hope. And that's the real reason why we decided to work on this, is we wanted to represent those who are at the nexus of the transfer of power and responsibility. Like you see in the picture, it's the passing of the baton. And at this moment, we feel that there is an opportunity to do something that had not been done before. So we don't necessarily need to do more of the same, nor do we need to have a slow and steady decline. In some ways, this power is going to groups that have never harnessed it before. It's going to the young. It's going to women. It's going to disenfranchised groups. And it's going to various countries around the world that had not necessarily participated in environmental health issues in the same way that they will be doing in the future. These very same people are the ones who are most impacted by our environmental health failures. And we believe that this transfer represents an opportunity to harness the ideas from the youth, to harness the ideas and the new energy that can be provided, and to hear some new voices. At the same time, people on both sides of the aisle, although they may have differing beliefs in other spheres, health is something that does not have a social economic barrier. It's something that does not care necessarily where you're located for you to be impacted. So on this issue, all people are able to join together, and we're able to discuss environmental health as one. So we had some key takeaways that we wanted everyone to have as they left this webinar today, because we don't believe that this is just an exercise in rhetoric, very similar to the idea of the Environmentalist Papers as a whole. It's not a discussion, it is an invitation to a conversation and an invitation to action. So what would we like for you to take away? The first thought is that a new future requires present action. In order to have something different in the future, we need to do something different right now. So one of the examples that I think of that sort of easily explains this and makes it really clear is we can think of our built environment. The built environment is not something that happens overnight. It normally requires planning, sometimes years before the actual structure is in place. Yet it's that point at the beginning of our plan when we have a choice. We can design and build something that's healthier for individuals to work in, and it's healthier for the environment, or we can choose at the beginning of our plan to continue to do things the way they were done before. To do things the way that they were done before, quite honestly, there are advantages to doing it that way. We know what to expect. Generally, it's going to be less expensive because the systems are already in place. It's going to be more predictable. It is the safe choice. But to move forward will require a completely different view. It requires us to have patience. It requires us to face some unknowns. It requires us to be flexible in our action. Yet, if we are going to transform our environmental health issues, this is the process that we must go through. If we're going to make the future different from the present, we have to make our actions different now. The other key takeaway is sharing the science. Science can contribute greatly to making wise decisions about tomorrow. In this audience, I'm sure that's already something that you're well aware of. But here it is our job to communicate what is known in a way that the layperson who is not a scientist can understand. Some of the work that I do is with the Institute for Alternative Futures, and specifically we work on health-related issues and what can be done about those in the future 10, 15, 20 years hence. And part of that, we have discovered a large part will be actually simply communicating the science. We will have technology that we do not have currently. And yet, if the layperson doesn't understand it nor understand what it can do for them, then it's all for naught. We talked about strategies for doing so earlier in the webinar, how to communicate science in a way that can be understood by others. And this is very important in moving forward and helping provide the vision for not only the health field, but for those who are outside of it. And lastly, as a key takeaway, it's to take individual responsibility. We've all been empowered by the marvelous world of technologies, both informational and social, to make our voices heard. And we have seen social movements like never before. Groups that have never been heard have a way of making their voice heard to others. We have access to knowledge and access to those of like mind to which we can collaborate. That means that we can all play a part and that we do have a role to play. So taking individual responsibility is something that is really important and something that we will be able to do like we've never been able to do before. But with that in mind, what are the next steps? In the work that I do at the center, we work with executives on an education program that helps them take sustainability problems and use that to move innovation through their company. The thing that we always ask is, what do we do on Monday morning? Having a lot of knowledge behind you can be helpful. Having wonderful ideas behind you can be helpful, but it always comes down to, what will we do on Monday morning? So we decided to come up with some next steps, some specific and concrete things that could be done by anyone on the call in order to move environmental health forward. The first was to form partnerships and to collaborate. Solving the huge problems requires a cross-sector or systems approach. It's not something that we can do in a silo. More collaborations are going to be needed in order to move our world forward. The institutions of higher learning are available as a resource to collaborate with. We frequently hear now that for-profit organizations or corporations are just tapping into the idea that institutions of higher learning are there available as a resource to go and get information from and to work with. And that includes things like product development. And within colleges and universities work together and form partnerships in order to drive forward their similar interests in environmental health. Next is having a de-risking strategy. Risk is something that we rarely think of, but yet it can become the major four-letter word when it comes to doing anything different. Yet these reactions are not baseless. Risk represents the unknown. It represents getting responses that we did not expect. And yet we have to move forward and be willing to accept the risk. So how do we de-risk something so that we are able and willing to move forward? Having a de-risking strategy, such as piloting a new plan, will help remove some of the doubt about venturing into a new area. And this is equally applicable whether you're talking about something that's organization-wide or on the individual level. So rather than trying to do one huge, large program, start with a program that's much smaller, see what the risks are, handle the smaller problems, and then make it larger. And then lastly, focusing your power for impact. We all have a set of resources that can be employed toward improving the health of our world. So really take stock of what your particular strengths, contacts, connections, and passions are, and focus on these. And again, this is both on the organizational level and the individual level. As an individual, we have contacts that we can use, strengths that we have, and the same for an organization. An organization, rather than having a passion, will have a mission. It will take many hands at the plow to get done the job that we need to have done. But if we all push in, operating from our area of strength, we will no longer delay action on environmental health, but instead will be pulled by our common desire to live our own and best collective life. And Karen, I'll turn it over to you so that you can begin with the questions and answers.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I see if you have a question, there's a question and answer box that you can type your question into, and I will be reading questions. Wendy Purcell asked, you say the science is unambiguous, but we as scientists communicate on the basis of probability, and this balanced messaging is often exploited by political leaders in the media. How can we express the message of probability as a certain platform for action?
This is Joe. I think it's a good question, Wendy. I mean, I'll think back to last week at Harvard's School of Public Health commencement. We had ex-EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy speaking exactly about this. And she talked about that science, we get lost in this world. You know, this paper has all these limitations, requires additional research. There's a greater likelihood than not, controlling for these other factors. And we have a hard time coming out and just saying it, right? Climate change is real, it's caused by us, and there are real health implications right now, very clear. So I think some of it's a little bit on us as scientists to be very clear on what the science says, and we make decisions based on the best available science we have at the time, knowing that science is evolving. And this is exactly what Gina McCarthy said. It's always evolving. Of course, there are additional questions that have to be asked every time. This is the enterprise, this is the nature of science, but it can't distract us from being very clear in how we talk about that science when it is unequivocal, many of these things we're talking about, right? That's a very good question. And Gina McCarthy addressed this head on last week. It was wonderful.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. This is Karen again. You know, as a lover of stats and a scientist, you know, I see why stats are so compelling. I mean, they're compelling to me. I liked how you guys talked about hitting people with the environmental health message, like where they are, like where their values are in an emotional way. So I was wondering, what has been the reaction to your vignettes from the public?
From what I think Anna and I've seen, because we're sitting next to each other, nodding in agreement, that I haven't seen a ton of reaction from the media or from the public in terms of comments. It was exciting to see how widely the piece was shared on different social media sites with kind of positive statements, whether it was on Facebook or Twitter. And I know from our colleagues here at the school, there was a lot of positive reception from the students. So I think come from a very broad, you know, range of backgrounds that we had no students ask questions or have hesitation or reservations when signing on to this piece, which we felt was a great symbol that these stories were being representative of the people and the places and the stories we were trying to represent. But in terms of other kind of more direct feedback from the public, I personally haven't seen, you know, anything more direct than that.
I'll tell you, through the website, environmentalistpapers.org, we have reached thousands of people who are now linking to these essays. And I think what would have happened if we didn't brand it under this theme is that they'd be lost, this diffuse voice. But now we have these multi-voices that are linked together through one common branding. It's amplified everybody. And I give credit to the three really bright scientists here, and that it's an extraordinary feat to get 118 signatures from students at 23 universities. That is impact in itself. And I hear it from the faculty conversations that are having from the students at those schools who have now reached out and talking to our dean. So that message is resonating across these universities, and it's empowering students to be part of this conversation, right? It's not the faculty and the deans, it's really about the students, the future. So I've seen that impact on other levels too.
Great. We have a question from Amanda Quintana, and it kind of goes with the question that I had. You know, in one of your vignettes, you talk about, you know, beauty products, and Anna, I think you mentioned that, you know, the regrettable substitution that consumers shouldn't have to follow up on every single, toxic that's been added and, oh, what's it substituted with? So, I think a lot of times people in environmental health struggle with how do we encourage people to go from taking action just in terms of what products you buy, at an individual level, or what cleaning products you use your home, to more collective action. And Amanda asked, do you have a list of things we can do to take actions as individuals right now and become involved? So along the same lines.
I think
Sure, that's great. Go ahead, Yasamina.
Thank you. Actually, I think that's a great question, and it's something that we discussed in what we feel is available in our takeaways and our next steps. Because environmental health itself is such a huge issue, there's so many things that fit into that area. That's why we talked about really focusing on your passions and your motivations, narrowing it down. So if each of us takes a smaller part of what's important, that we can get a mass collective of what's important done. But it is very difficult, I agree with you, Amanda, to attempt to impact environmental health as a whole, but by really focusing in on those areas that are specific to you, then that is one way to move it forward. And I'll turn it back over to you, Anna.
Yeah, and as citizens and scientists and professionals and experts, there are other things we can do, like calling our representatives and telling them how much these issues matter for our communities. We can start writing about these issues in op-eds and talking about them locally, why it matters for local communities. We should continue to engage in conversations with people of different beliefs and not just immediately disengage if they don't share our views. We should listen to them, listen to what values they have, and try to find common ground on how these values relate to environmental health. And as students and professors, we can work together in our programs to learn skills, learn media skills and communication techniques, and begin training ourselves in how to get this science out there. And then at the back end more, we can also start doing more action and policy-oriented research and start answering the questions that will be important for action.
Great. Let's see, I had another question. Oh, actually, we just had a question come in from Camille. How do you suggest bringing together this work with the sustainable business work in the for-profit world? Areas like energy improvements are profitable, but areas such as safer chemicals require investment and transformation. What are your thoughts?
One of the things that I have seen is a lot of that comes down to the leadership of the organization. And when you have either leadership that already takes that viewpoint, or you have a collective of workers who share in the importance of things such as safer chemicals, those are things where you don't necessarily see that immediate ROI that companies like to have for their quarterly reporting, and it requires a longer term thinking. So a lot of times that comes from either the leadership of the company or from the workforce asking for it, or the consumers asking for it.
Yeah, I'll add, okay. Well, I would add too, this is what we do at this Center for Health and Global Environment here, is that we partner with businesses. Good businesses, right? Because I think if we're going to be successful in advancing the sustainability and health movement, we're going to have to partner with good companies if we're going to do it quickly. And there are plenty of companies out there that want to do well while also doing well for their, in terms of profit. I think that's perfectly fine as long as we're advancing health collectively for everyone, everywhere, as part of that same mission.
And you mentioned safer chemicals in the question, and we've seen a lot of industry support for policies on safer chemicals, which has been really wonderful. And they sort of just want standard regulations across the board with guidance that they can follow. And, they care about these issues and want to do what they can. So I think it also starts with policy and regulation to spur innovation.
And I think as a bright spot, you do see more and more corporations and organizations moving in that direction. So there's almost like a positive peer pressure that happens to be taking place now, where you're seeing organizations that get together, such as I'm thinking of things like conscious capitalism, for example, where companies are coming together to actually take those ideas into account and move in a positive direction with what they can do within their corporation.
Great. I had one other question. You know, you guys talked about your communication objectives, and the third one was to encourage nonpartisan discussion. And I was just wondering, I feel like sometimes now just even mentioning the word environment is partisan. So, what do we do in, our time for, how can we move past this polarization of even, environment of just the word science?
That's a great question. I don't know if it's one that there's an answer to. Is, every news update we get, it kind of makes things a little more questionable. But something I think I've found helpful is that since we are in public health, by framing environmental messages in terms of the health consequences that these things can have for you, for your family, for the community that you live in, that you can gain a lot of traction, because health is something everyone cares about. I think Yasamina said it earlier, when we discuss health, we are discussing it as one. It becomes a unified mission that we can speak in line with. And I know in my own personal communication, framing it in this way and kind of providing the science and the why we should care, but in terms of how this directly influences your health or somebody else's health, can make some headway, but I think there's still definitely a divide when it comes to these words today, which is unfortunate.
Right. When we were starting this project, we got questions or lots of debate with scientists whether or not we should even call it the Environmentalist Papers, because the environmentalist is such a loaded term. But I felt very passionate and felt very strongly that we should. And the reason why is that I want to take ownership back of the word, right? What's so dirty about the environment besides what we're doing to it? But it shouldn't be a dirty word. It's in our collective interest. And, I liked, again, going back to environmentalist number 5, the one before this student's work was Gina McCarthy at EPA. And she talks about the core mission at EPA always has been and always will be protecting public health. And this is what Augusta was talking about, that if we frame environment to mean health, which is the strategy, remember we have the goal, strategy, and tactics, the strategy to tie environmental health. And personally, I think this is a winning strategy for gaining back, or at least keeping these basic environmental protections in place that are widely supported when people realize that this is ultimately a health issue.
Yeah, and I think that you're seeing even with climate change that people are framing it more and more as, about your health, because that is a message that people relate to. People don't really relate to, carbon dioxide and things like that. So yeah, I definitely agree. We had one other question from a participant about, do you have any examples of, successes or programs that you have been seeing implemented by health system organizations to address some of the issues that you raised? I think that by health systems, they mean, preventative public health, and our health system is, very focused on curing diseases and disabilities.
All right, so I have an example of one. I'll give the students if they want to add in, but yeah, I think some of the work that you can look at some of the big players here, like Kaiser Permanente, for example, and Anna gives some really great examples of the issue of regrettable substitution with chemicals, and you see some of these groups that are recognizing the cost of the environment on health and taking concrete action. For example, Kaiser is no longer using the halogenated flame retardants, and they're moving away from the fluorinated, polyfluorinated chemicals. And they don't use triclosan, antimicrobial, in their hospitals. So there's leadership there from a group that recognizes the cost for inaction in these areas. And so I think they provide a good example. In fact, it's a bad example of what we're doing right here at Harvard with our own Healthier Building Materials Academy. And to say, well, look what Kaiser's doing. Why can't we do the same thing right here at our university, and then encourage other universities to follow this lead? So those are at least one example of a really positive change happening on the prevention side from big organizations.
Something that came to my mind, although at a different scale than what Dr. Allen brought up, was reports that come out of the federal government agencies like the U.S. Global Change Report that brings together both the environmentalist organizations like the EPA that you might typically think would be involved, but also other organizations, including things like the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy, to kind of come at this in a more holistic and comprehensive way that, to me, seems hopeful that climate change is a national security problem and poses energy challenges, and is not just about the temperature and things like that. That when you have multiple agencies sitting at the table discussing this, you can gain a lot more interest from health players across the board, even if they aren't typically the health groups that we might have thought of them before.
Okay, great. I had one last question since we don't have any from the attendees. I think, Yasamina, you talked about how, you were inspired because you had lived close to Flint, and Anna, you come from a family of farmers. Augusta. So Anna, I wanted to ask, what sparked your initial interest in this field as a public health student, and were there any, was it something that happened in your life, or was it a study that you read?
So for me, I think it was more about, I felt I didn't know anything about these environmental issues for so long, and then finding out about a lot of them, you sort of feel almost betrayed. Like if you knew these issues, if you knew how to prevent certain health effects from certain products you use, or those kinds of things, then you would do them, but you just don't know, and you're not really consenting to these issues. And then I started learning about, DDT and plasticizers and all these really bad chemicals that harm children and are really bad for pregnant women especially, and that's what sparked my interest in reproductive health as it relates to environmental issues, which is what I'm focusing on now, and also how workers are vulnerable and how they're exposed to chemicals, very disproportionately, which is something we didn't really have the space to talk about in this article, but which is also a huge environmental issue.
Great. So I think that wraps up the Q&A session. I just really wanted to thank you guys for your inspiring essay and for joining us today. I think that Che is definitely going to take your communication objectives. We're going to remind ourselves about those four: personalized, simple and clear, encourage nonpartisan, and convey consensus. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So we are approaching the end of our webinar today. A video recording of today's webinar will be available on the Che website soon. Che's next webinar will take place on Tuesday, June 13th, and is titled The Scientific Integrity Act, Preserving Research and Open Communication for the Common Good. You can RSVP through Che's website, healthandenvironment.org. If you are new to Che and would like to learn more about becoming a Che partner, please visit the Join Now page of the Che website. Additionally, if you appreciate these Che partnership webinars, we encourage you to support Che's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. With that, I want to thank our speakers once more for taking the time to present today, and Karen for her moderation. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great day.